Donald Trump's recent announcement that he plans to blockade the Strait of Hormuz is proof positive that he is acting only in his own interests and in no one else's. Not the best interests of the United States as a whole, and certainly not in the best interests of the global economy. He is out for himself and himself alone. And frankly, at this point, that shouldn't surprise anyone. Hi, I'm Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. The United States and Iran just held some of the highest level peace talks that have been held in decades, and they almost immediately failed. And within hours, Donald Trump announced that the U.S. Navy would begin blockading the Strait of Hormuz, interdicting any and all ships in and out of the Persian Gulf. That is not a good faith policy adjustment. That is an escalation inside an ongoing war. The United States and Iran have already been engaged in direct military confrontation. And let's be clear, it was started by the United States and Israel. There was no imminent threat to either Israel or the United States when we attacked Iran. Now, there is a fragile ceasefire in place. The ceasefire was imposed to facilitate negotiations held in Pakistan, which were an attempt to end the conflict overall. They broke down over three core issues. One, Iran's nuclear program. Two, control of the Strait of Hormuz. And three, economic leverage tied to sanctions and oil. And by the way, it's not like those are three new issues. These have pretty much been the issues at play with regard to U.S. foreign policy in Iran since the 1950s. And immediately after those negotiations broke down, Donald Trump announced a blockade. That sequence matters because it shows that the United States delegation is not negotiating good faith. Now, let's not sanitize what a blockade is. A naval blockade is widely understood as an act of war under the Geneva Conventions and other laws of armed conflict. A blockade involves using military force to stop ships from exercising freedom of navigation, boarding parties, seizing vessels, potentially even engaging them with hostile fires. And in this particular case, we're not just talking about some isolated coastline. We're talking about the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in the global economy, through which roughly 20% of the oil flows on any given day. So when you threaten to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, you're not just confronting Iran, you are threatening the global economy. The deeper issue here is that this blockade isn't just a direct threat to the global economy, it also exposes the fallacious premise of the negotiations themselves. Case in point, the United States is demanding that Iran give up its nuclear program entirely. That was never a realistic goal. Even under the Obama-era Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the high watermark of U.S.-Iran diplomacy in the last century, Iran did not agree to eliminate its nuclear program. It agreed to limit it, it agreed to monitor it, it agreed to subject its nuclear program to IAEA inspections. But that's as far as they were willing to go, even in a good faith environment. Now fast forward. Donald Trump tears up that deal for no better reason than it was one of Obama's crowning achievements. The trust between Iran and the United States as institutions falls apart completely, especially when Donald Trump is at the helm. Then the United States sucker punches Iran. Retaliatory strikes by Iran inevitably follow. That was simply never going to happen. Because again, even setting aside the incredibly bad faith of the United States over the last couple of months and years, you have to understand what Iran's nuclear program means to it and to its controlling regime. The United States is treating Iran's nuclear program like it's some kind of bargaining chip, but for Iran, it is not a bargaining chip. It is an existential issue. From Iran's perspective, they've got a lot of data to back up certain assumptions underlying these negotiations. One is that agreements with the United States might not hold. Two, the United States is ready, willing, and able to use military force at the drop of a hat. And so three, without a nuclear deterrent, they are exposed. So when you ask the Iranian regime to give up their nuclear program, you're not asking for a concession. You're asking them to give up the one thing that they believe is likely to keep them alive. And that's a non-starter. And if, as the United States under Donald Trump has, you build a negotiation around a demand that the other side cannot accept, and then escalate when they refuse, you are not negotiating, you are overplaying your hand. And that's what this blockade really is. Donald Trump overplaying his hand. So just briefly, let's step back and look at what incentives are driving this. You don't need to speculate wildly about intent here. You can infer what Donald Trump is thinking from the situation. Donald Trump is entering these negotiations after a costly military conflict, a fragile ceasefire, and mounting political pressure at home related largely to the Epstein files, to say nothing of his mishandling a whole bunch of other major political issues. With regard to Iran, Trump really only has two available options right now: accept a limited deal that looks like a compromise, or force a maximalist outcome that looks like a decisive win. Donald Trump knows that he's not going to maintain control of the White House with the former. He has to get the latter. Donald Trump knows that his party is not going to win the midterms with the former. And if the Republicans don't win the midterms, he is going to be impeached. And if he is impeached, he is probably going to be convicted this time. And if he is convicted and removed from office, he is likely to face criminal jeopardy for a variety of misdeeds in the criminal courts of both the United States and the various states where he's lived. This is a long way of coming to the conclusion that Donald Trump has to not only win the Iran war, he has to achieve a result that is a spectacular success, or he is dead in the water as a politician. If the negotiations with Iran yield something that looks very similar to the JICPOA framework, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action under President Obama, it looks like Donald Trump has failed massively. And in reality, he has. He will have achieved a position that is nearly identical to the one that was active on the day he entered office in 2017. But he will only have achieved that position through the exorbitant expenditures of both blood and treasure of the United States. So the only outcome that actually serves his position is one that can be framed as an overwhelming success, total victory. And if that's the only acceptable outcome, escalation is almost inevitable. Because backing down and actually compromising, actually negotiating, actually getting to an artful deal carries enormous political costs for Donald Trump. Escalation defers it by pushing those decisions down the road. And let's not forget the other data point that reinforces this assessment. Just days before this escalation, the United States was demanding that Iran reopen the Straits of Hormuz to all shipping. And Iran's response was not a total refusal. It was conditional. They signaled a willingness to allow traffic to resume, meaning that oil could flow into the global economy again, but with the exception of U.S.-flagged vessels. Think about that. From a global perspective, that outcome would have restored most of the energy flows, stabilized global energy markets, and reduced immediate economic risk. But it would have come with a cost. It would have left the United States to be singled out, symbolically diminished. And what we saw next was telling. That kind of partial solution, one that reduced global harm but imposed reputational costs on Donald Trump, got rejected. So instead of negotiating from a position that could have reestablished stability to the global economy, Donald Trump is instead choosing to go for broke at the risk of collapsing the global economy and affecting the interests of his own people at home. So take a step back and look at the full pattern. We have a negotiation built around an unrealistic demand, a predictable breakdown of those negotiations, a partial off-ramp that would have allowed Donald Trump to reduce global harm, but at the expense of his own reputation. Donald Trump predictably rejecting that off-ramp and instead doubling down in an attempt to save face at the expense of his own people's interests. That sequence tells you everything you need to know. Because at that point, Donald Trump isn't just making a foreign policy decision, he is making a decision about priorities, his own personal priorities. He is choosing between accepting a limited outcome that reduces risk but looks like compromise, or escalating in a way that preserves leverage and the appearance of strength, even if it comes at a global cost and harms his own people. What this suggests, reasonably based on the pattern, is that Donald Trump is avoiding the appearance of backing down at the expense of broader economic harm. Donald Trump is now on a path where he is willing to impose significant costs, not just on Iran, but on the global economy and by extension, his own people, in order to sustain a negotiating position that was never realistic in the first place. That's not leverage. That's not good diplomacy. That's escalation driven by personal constraints. That's not how conflict gets resolved. That's how it escalates.